One of the discussion questions we tackle in this unit on Buddhism is what philosophical questions, or in other words, speculations, did the Buddha leave undeclared? And why did he answer these big questions this way? And so, philosophical questions such as where did the universe come from? Is there a soul? Is the soul immortal? Is there life after death? Is the universe eternal or created? Is there a God or are there gods? These he left undeclared. Why did he leave them undeclared? So the anthology records a famous parable that's said to have been spoken by the Buddha about a man who's shot with an arrow. So a man is shot with an arrow. He's got the arrow in his belly, and he tells his friend who's assisting him, or who calls a doctor and brings him, that he will not allow that arrow to be extracted from him unless he knows the name of the person who shot him, the name of the father of the person who shot him, the name of the children of the person who shot him, what caste is the person that shot him, what's the color of the eyes of the person that shot him, is the person tall or short, right? These are, you'd think, well, that's a complete waste of time. That he has an arrow in his belly, he needs to get it out, he needs to be patched up before he gets infected and he dies. Right? These sorts of questions are a complete waste of time and are unnecessary. So these sorts of questions about life after death, eternal life, whether the universe is eternal or created, who created, or are there gods or one God, right? These are all questions that you might think are rather important, but in the estimation of the Buddha, that was quite secondary to the more crucial questions of how to eliminate grief, misery, sorrow, suffering, old age, and allow a person to enter nirvana. So with this notion foregrounded in our minds, we should look at other teachings of the Buddha. Right? He regarded all his teachings about reality to be helpful hints, guidelines, heuristic devices that are as a raft to help one get across the river of samsara. Once one has gotten across the river, the raft is no longer necessary. One is able to experience reality as it truly is without any sort of these helpful hints or guidelines, right? You don't need to talk about nirvana or Atman or Anatman or impermanence or permanence, right? These are all sort of secondary and inconsequential. You're experiencing reality as it truly is once you've gotten across the river of samsara and gotten through delusions or maya. Okay, so the Buddha talks about nirvana actually very little. Okay, this seems to be the supreme goal, but he talks about it very little. Yet nirvana, which literally means to blow out, like blowing out a candle. He says very little on it, and why is this? Well, it seems to be that talking about such a thing can only digress one or be an obstacle to actually understanding what that thing is. Rather, one must experience whatever that is directly to only know what it is, even though that is the goal. But he gives some other helpful hints on how to think about the world, which will help us on our path. One is the idea of an-atman, okay, which is usually translated as no self or no soul. Now, you can recognize the word Atman there that we saw in Hinduism and the famous pronouncement of the Upanishads that Atman equals Brahman, right? One's soul or self is equivalent to the ultimate, the ground of all things, Brahman. But just like in English, when we add an to something, it often negates that thing. So think of aerobics with air exercise versus anaerobics without air exercise, right? So an Atman means an no Atman, no self, no soul. Now this should be very surprising to you if you unless you come from a Buddhist background. Right? Many people feel or believe the whole point of religion is to prepare one for an afterlife. Right? The soul is eternal, and that soul must prepare itself for either heaven or hell. But wait, if there is no soul or eternal soul, well, what's the whole point of religion itself? So it seems that an Atman is this heuristic device in thinking about ourselves, not so much of a inflexible doctrine that one should passionately uphold as if life depends on it, but perhaps hold on to it much more than one holds on to the idea of an Atman, or excuse me, of that one does have a permanent self or permanent eternal soul. Right? Once we think about who we are, what our characteristics are, what creates what we like about ourselves, right? Is what am I good at? Okay, what gives me prestige? What makes me look good in the eyes of others? Right? Clinging onto such notions of self can actually distract and impede one from truly developing who and what one is and one's spiritual potentials, right? It impedes further growth and development. You become stuck in this is me, and this is what I stand for, and this is what I am, and this is what affirms me in society and to my friends and gives me status and importance. Likewise, the Buddha proclaims that the things around us, including ourselves, are impermanent, right? When we look at things, I have a spoon right here, right? It's a very metal, nice spoon my wife and I got for our wedding, right? When you look at that, it's like, that's pretty permanent. Like, that's not going anywhere fast. But when you look at it closer, you can see some scratches on it, and some of it has chipped off slowly. It's deteriorating until perhaps 10, 20, 50 years from now, won't be that good of a spoon anymore, and our family will have to retire it. So the notion here is that clinging onto hopes of permanence, that things are going to stay as they are now, actually leads to further suffering, right? Rather than accepting that things are going to change, nothing's going to stay the same. There's people in our lives that are here now that aren't going to be there later. There's stuff in our lives that's here now that's not going to be the same later, or even exist later, right? Accepting the transmutation and constant change in the world and our condition in the world is more conducive to non-suffering, peace, equanimity than trying to hold on and cling onto things that's always staying there. We'll look more at the idea of sunyata, or emptiness and openness, in the next lecture, and I won't say anything more about that now, right? So Buddhism, you can say, is a non-theistic religion in that no gods are the focus of it. Those of us from perhaps a Jewish or Christian or Muslim background usually think of God as being the central question of religion, whereas for religions like Jainism and Buddhism, they are not, right? These are helpful guidelines, anatman, impermanence, and some others we'll look at in the next slides. These ways of looking at the world are more central to help one grow and spiritually develop and move closer to nirvana than any questions of gods or the lack thereof. So in this way, Buddhism is non-theistic. However, it can also be said that it's trans-theistic, for it accepts that gods do exist or probably exist, but Buddhism doesn't think the gods are of any real consequence or importance to one's spiritual progress and movement towards nirvana. Rather, there's a self-reliance which seems to be at the heart of the beginnings of Buddhism, which you must be, in a way, your own refuge, your own haven, even while you're taking refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma, in the Sangha or community as an example and support and guidance in moving along the path of spiritual progress. In fact, Buddhism teaches that gods, if they do exist, are really actually beings that have attained an enormous amount of merit called punya, and through this merit, through acting in a good way that they've attained an enormous amount of spiritual power, as well as a long life. But even the gods' punya or merit will one day wear out, and then they'll be left in a situation like many of the rest of us human creatures. You can't rely on the gods to help you or hinder you. Rather, you must rely upon yourself to move forward on the spiritual path. Along with anatman and impermanence, the beginning teachings, sometimes considered to be part of his first sermon that he gave in Deer Park, is the proclamation of the Four Noble Truths. That is, that life is characterized by dukkha. Okay. The word dukkha can be translated as suffering, but it can also be translated as unsatisfactoriness. Everything's are unsatisfactory, or one is suffering, right? This is dukkha. Or the cause of dukkha is tanha. Okay, so what is this thing, tanha? So it's often translated as desire, okay, but it also has been translated as craving. And some Buddhist teachers distinguish desires and cravings from aspirations. Okay? They say that it's good to have aspirations to grow upon the spiritual path of Buddhism. Okay? Following the footsteps of the Buddha is a good aspiration. To be kind to others, right, is a Buddhist ethic. It's good to have this aspiration. Right? One should aspire to meditate on a daily basis to help one become in touch with reality, more grounded, and able to deal with the changing conditions of daily life. Right? These are all good aspirations, but this is different from desire and craving. Right? These are those things that are beyond our bare necessities or basic needs to be able to live in a basically healthy and physically flourishing way. So what are these bare necessities, right? Maybe basic amount of food, right? Some shelter, right? Clean water, regular sleep at night, clean air to breathe, right? Clothes to wear, right? Do we need to be able to have our favorite kinds of restaurant foods every single day? Maybe not, right? Do we need to have the 9-bedroom mansion when maybe 1 or 2 bedrooms would suffice, right? Do we really need to crave after that latest 0 to 80 in 4 seconds sort of sports car, right? Or is our dinky Pinto good enough to get us from point A to point B? Or is the bus good enough even? So craving after these things, these inordinate desires, these beyond the basic needs, is a source of suffering and unsatisfactoriness in our lives, right? This is the whole rap song. I wish I were a little bit taller. I wish I were a baller. I wish I had a girl with a phone I would call her, right? This is sure it'd be nice to be a little taller, but is it really necessary? Sure, it'd be nice to be a really good basketball player, but is it really that important in the big scheme of things? Sure, it'd be nice to have a girlfriend or boyfriend who has a phone, but perhaps it's not so necessary for a good life, good flourishing life. So the third truth then naturally leads from the first two. We can end dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, or suffering by giving up tanha, these inordinate or unnecessary cravings and desires. And so what are we left with then? Right, we've eliminated cravings and desire, and hence we're not. Life isn't so unsatisfactory. We don't experience suffering. What is left? We just kind of lay on our bed and do nothing. No, the way, the guidelines to live your life is called the Noble Eightfold Path, and this is what one does actually in one's daily life, or the guidelines one gets to move towards nirvana. Okay, so Noble Eightfold Path is usually organized into three different categories: wisdom, okay, things of wisdom, things of conduct, and things of focus, mental development. Right. So wisdom, meaning to understand the way things are, how reality is in the right way, have the right intentions, right, to have goodwill towards all people, including oneself, they spiritually grow and be good and flourish themselves, right, to have the right conduct, right speech, avoiding lying or gossip or speaking ill about or to people, rather they, in the words, uplift other people and speak reality and speak truth in a diplomatic way that brings people up. Right action. So this is closely linked to the value of ahimsa, which Buddhism, like Jainism, proclaims, although not to the same extreme. So action which does not harm or hurt the world, but leads to life and flourishing of life. Right. So this right livelihood, one, even though one might make a lot of money at it, most likely one would not be working for as a bartender and giving people alcoholic drinks, or in a store that serves alcoholic substances, for this hinders right understanding and makes people have poor choices and being able to maneuver their vehicles, and leads to all kinds of violence, or working for an arms manufacturer in some capacity, although one might convince oneself that, perhaps by creating these arms it actually prevents violence itself, but perhaps a more strict Buddhist understanding would be that you're actually participating in the making of something which very raison d'être, right, there's very reason for existence, is to destroy, and one would not want to participate in that according to strict understanding. Right, focus or mental development, or samadhi, right effort, right mindfulness, right meditation. Right, this is being very present to what one is doing, how one is doing it, what is one's mental state while one does it. Okay, this is often practiced in meditation, but carrying forward meditative states of mindfulness to one's daily actions. So if you haven't concluded this yet, we can state explicitly that there's lots of numbers or collection of things or collection of concepts or values or perspectives within Buddhism. Right, we've already seen the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path. We've seen the 5 vows or commitments. Right, these are and here we have the 3 marks of existence. So this is a good way to think about how reality truly is. This raft that'll get you across that river is to think about the world as having a ten of dukkha, as being impermanent. This is the word anitya or anicca. And to think of the self as not a self or permanent self at all, an atman, which we've already described these concepts. To speak a little bit more on atman, okay, according to Buddhist metaphysics, what we call the self doesn't have any sort of underlying substance, which is the ground of everything. There's no I at the bottom of everything. Per se. Rather, it's better to think of the self as a composite, or it's more realistic to think of one's experience of self as a composite reality. Okay, by a composite, it's lots of different stuff put together that creates that experience of self or I, or oneself as a conscious, real being with some permanence from one moment to the next. Okay, so it's a combination of physical processes, right? Our stomachs are doing what they're doing, the heart's doing what it's doing, pumping blood, right? The neurons are sending signals, right? These are very fundamental to creating an experience of self. Our sense perceptions, think of the five senses, right? This creates our conscious reality, and very much is a big contributor. Our thoughts, whatever we're thinking at the moment, is very much creating our sense of self. Oh, I'm a real being. Look, I have these thoughts, right? I'm a permanent being, right? And it combines with this physical processes and sense perceptions, of course. I'm a real being. Whatever feelings or emotions of sadness or joy or disappointment or anxiety, right? These feelings, these are very real feelings in our experience. So I'm a real me. Volition, right? I'm a person that makes choices and I have a will to do this or that. I choose to do this, or I choose not to do this. I choose to stop watching this online lecture now, or I choose to continue to watch because perhaps it's interesting or it's giving you helpful information about this religion, right? This is your volition, your memories, right? You remember what you did when you're younger. You remember what you did yesterday, right? This creates a sort of idea that one is a permanent being from one moment to the next, as continuity from at least our earliest memories of at 2 or 3 years old. This is the same me that's been going on from then to now. But perhaps one is just a being with all these processes going on and feelings and thoughts and perceptions going on, and that's experiencing those things that creates that consciousness, and there's no permanent you that's been going on from one moment to the next. Even the language we use or I use to describe this hinders really getting a good comprehension, because you notice I said my feelings or my thoughts or my experiences, right? Rather, the only me there is, according to a strict interpretation of this principle, is physical processes, is sense perceptions, is thoughts, feelings, volition, memories. Okay, so this composite reality is and has these things going on, to be more precise. Not one of the 3 marks of existence, but a concept that's closely related to these 3 marks of existence within Buddhism is that of dependent arising or dependent origination. This is the teaching that instead of typical philosophical logic that at the beginning of any sort of chain of processes going on, there has to be a beginning to that thing, right? There has to be a source that does not have any source that precedes it. Okay, a cause that doesn't have any cause that precedes it. There has to be some beginning to any sort of chain of movements are happening in the world, right? The sort of, I was born because my parents were born, because my grandparents were born, because my great-grandparents were born. You can go back if you have a Jewish or Christian understanding or Islamic understanding, perhaps all the way back to Adam and Eve, because they were born. It began this whole process. Well, there's even something that precedes this. It's God. God created Adam and Eve, and so this is the beginning of this whole process, right? There's this God or being that is the beginning cause of all causes, right? The idea of dependent arising, dependent origination is that there is no beginning cause of all causes. Rather, there's just a grand multiplicity of forces and processes at work, all interacting with each other. And these things have interacted with each other forever, as long as we can, and might continue to exist or happen and interact, right? So there's no independent or beginning cause which causes all the other things to happen. So in Buddhism, the big problem of existence is that of dukkha, okay? This unsatisfactoriness and suffering, qualities of life, which pervades our realities, and that of samsara, right? This cycle of birth, growing old, death, and rebirth, and re-death, on and on, right? We want to get out of this, and these teachings of the Buddha are for this purpose. Okay, so how can we apply these teachings to different aspects of life that give us grief and misery, and perhaps eventually stop being reborn to this world completely? Right? These words that pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, seems to be the Buddhist prescription or remedy for this daily life. We're going to have discomforts, we're going to have things that we don't like, but Buddhism provides an approach to deal with them in the most healthy way so that these discomforts don't actually become a cause of suffering. Okay, so how would a Buddhist face the reality of illness? Well, first it'd prescribe the middle way, right? So that one is getting the bare necessities of life, and of food, clean water, sleep, rest, exercise, so that illness might rarely happen in one's life, right? Even overeating can weaken the immune system and become a source of illness. If one actually, despite one's doing all these things, still becomes ill, right? One doesn't dwell on these things or think that this situation one is in right now is one's permanent situation, right? Knowing that this too will pass and be all over very soon enough, right? So to have this sort of detachment, even while one is compassionate towards the difficulties in one's physical state at the moment, might be the way a Buddhist faces illness, okay? Facing old age, right? So following the middle way, so one is as healthy and flourishing as one can be through old age, okay? But also knowing that everything has to change, right? It'd be nice to be forever young. I want to be forever young. I really like to live forever young, right? But knowing that one and everyone has to get old, right? That these changes in life are a fact of life. Okay, one can face one's getting older with acceptance, rather than trying to cling onto some desire for eternal youth. And the same would apply to facing death, whether one's own mortality or the mortality of friends and loved ones. And there's a famous parable in Buddhism about the story of the mother and the mustard seed. And the story briefly goes like this. A mother's child dies, and she's in complete, it's just a small child, and the mother's in great grief, as you can well imagine, and she can't get over her grief and her sense of loss for her loved child, and she asks friends if anyone could help her recover her child, or at least get a sense of closure with this, and they don't have much advice for her, but they refer her to the Buddha. And so she goes to the Buddha and asks his help to bring back her son who she's lost, and the Buddha tells her to gather some mustard seed. He needs some mustard seed to help her with this, and to gather mustard seed from a home which has never experienced death. Okay, so she goes to all her neighbors, house to house, asking for some mustard seed, but first asking, have you had anyone die here? And they say, oh yeah, we've had Grandma Betty, or Grandpa so and so, or my child died, or what have you. So she goes to another one, same sort of answers, another one, same sort of answers. After going to a bunch of different houses, she finally goes back to the Buddha and said, I went to 80 houses and all of them experienced death, so I wasn't able to get you any of the mustard seed we need to help me with this. And the Buddha asked her, well, what did you learn from this whole process? And says, well, I realized that death is a part of life for everyone, not just me. And she was able to accept the fact of her child's death with a much more brave heart. How does one deal with disturbances of change with the Buddhist teachings, right? Life is constantly in flux and motion. We're not forever a child, we move into youth. We're not forever a youth, move into adulthood. Not forever a young adult, we move into middle age, then old age if we're lucky. Right, we're sometimes we'll experience having great cash flow if we're fortunate. Sometimes we won't have enough cash flow, right? Sometimes we'll have our favorite friend in our life, or have a certain boyfriend or girlfriend. Sometimes there's going to be nasty breakups, or more or less nasty breakups, right? Sometimes divorce happens for a married couple, right? There's all kinds of these disturbing changes that can happen. Some changes are good and one might look forward to, but often change is a great source of anxiety, angst, and grief in our lives, right? So instead of clinging or grasping, this is called upadana, clinging, grasping, upadana in the Sanskrit, to any sort of situation, hoping and wanting it to be the permanent and the way things should be and always be. I'll always have this money, I'll always have this loved one in my life, right? Accepting that things constantly change, right? This ideal of impermanence, this ideal of not clinging to these worldly things can be applied in many different ways, right? Some sort of sense pleasure, right? Instead of wanting to have this delicious food and be able to eat it non-stop for a long time, knowing that you're gonna need to satiate yourself and have enough very soon, and be okay with stopping to eat it or some other sense pleasure, right? Some sort of worldly pursuit, some sort of object or material possession that you're clinging to get, which becomes a source of suffering. Okay? Even becoming self-projections, right? I'm just going to be happy, I'm going to be satisfied when I become a very successful lawyer in a firm, or very successful medical doctor, or when I have a boyfriend or girlfriend, then I'm going to be happy, right? These sort of self-projections, or when I become a very good soccer player or become a very, very good dancer, then I'm going to be happy, right? And these sort of projections in the future, rather than being mindful of the moment and aspiring to be the best one can be, and gaining a sense of satisfaction that right effort to be the best one can be at that moment is a more positive way to go. So we've already talked about these things. Okay. This statement, first comes tanha, craving or desire, right? Then comes attachment and clinging or grasping, upadana. Clinging and grasping after things, thinking they're going to be there and always be there. Okay, but this attachment, this clinging or grasping, this keeps us linked or chained or hooked into samsara, okay, which produces negative karma and keeps one rebirthing, redying into this world again and again, right? This is why the ideal of detachment, even while one is empathetic and compassionate towards oneself and others, right? This is why detachment is such a central value within the Buddhist system. Okay, so we already mentioned that the Buddha doesn't describe what is nirvana very often. Many of us know this word, if no more from the heavy metal band called Nirvana. Nirvana literally means to blow out. Think of blowing out a candle. Some Buddhists interpret this notion as that of self-extinction or self-obliteration, right? When one attains nirvana in this life, one becomes completely detached and free of clinging to this world, and then when one enters parinirvana, P-A-R-I, nirvana, this is the final end nirvana, then there's nothing more. The self is completely, or at least the experience of self as self is completely extinguished. Okay, there's no more you, no more no more me. Okay, there's no more consciousness left. This is the interpretation of some Buddhists of the idea of nirvana. Okay. For other Buddhists, it is the blowing out or extinction of these three poisons or three evils that keep us down, that keep us in a state of suffering, that keeps us rebirthing. Okay, these three poisons are attachment itself, okay, ill will, okay, wishing bad or having negative feelings towards other people, other things, or aspects of life. Okay. Ignorance or delusion, having a false conception of reality. Right. These are the things that are blown out. Okay. And when these things are blown out, right, one attains supreme freedom and peace as in one's consciousness. And for some, this state of freedom continues. This complete peace continues when one is physically dead, but in this state is not reborn, but continues in this state of freedom in one's consciousness. Okay, so this is the way that the famous scripture of Buddhism, the Dhammapada, describes nirvana: free from sorrow, free from the fetters of life. Like a bird flying invisibly in the sky, he has found freedom. Peaceful his thinking, peaceful his speech, peaceful his deed, tranquil his mind. Okay. Flying free like this bird, in a complete state of peace, tranquility, equanimity.